It was a night like any other, the kind where the world outside seemed to fade into silence, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint drip of a distant faucet. I had walked these corridors hundreds of times before, the cold steel drawers and the antiseptic scent of the morgue feeling almost familiar, almost routine. But that night, everything changed. It started with a sound so subtle I almost convinced myself it was the wind rattling the old pipes. A tiny creak, a whisper of movement from a drawer at the far end of the room. I froze, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. At first I thought it was my imagination. Morgues have a way of turning ordinary noises into whispers of the dead, but then it happened again. A shudder, a twitch, unmistakable. I walked closer, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. And then I saw her, Jane Thompson, 46 years old. A woman whose life had ended, or so we believed. Her eyes, half-lidded and glassy, blinked. Her fingers twitched, curling and uncurling as if reaching for something just beyond the edge of consciousness. I stumbled backward, the cold metal of the drawer frame biting into my palm as I tried to steady myself. Disbelief, horror, and an inexplicable awe collided in my chest. How could this be happening? How could someone declared dead move in a morgue, under the sterile glare of judgment that the living should not trespass? Her movement was slow, deliberate, almost surreal. A half-formed attempt to lift herself, to sit, to reach toward the world she had supposedly left behind. The clinical, emotionless environment of the morgue became a stage for something I could neither name nor explain. Machines in the distant hospital corridors beeped and hummed, their monotone rhythm a stark contrast to the living miracle, or nightmare, before me. My training as a morgue assistant offered no guidance here. There are protocols for handling bodies, for documenting, for respecting the deceased, but none for witnessing what I now faced. A body moving as if resisting the finality we so confidently assigned it. I remember the weight of the moment pressing on me. Fear? Yes, but also a strange reverence. Jane was not a ghost. She was not an apparition. She was human, fragile and defiant, caught between life and death in a way science struggles to explain. My mind raced through every medical textbook, every lecture, every experience, trying to rationalize. Could it be a misdiagnosis? A rare form of catalepsy? Or something even stranger, a reminder that the boundaries of mortality are not as rigid as we believe? The answers eluded me. And yet, there was something undeniably intimate in that motion, a fleeting assertion of presence, a whisper of consciousness lingering beyond the veil. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed to call for help, to do something, anything. But the horror was compounded by the ethical paralysis. What do you do when the dead are not entirely dead? How do you honor life when you've been trained to honor its absence? Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in what felt like suspended reality. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, her movement ceased. Jane lay still once more, her chest barely rising, eyes closing as if she had simply drifted to sleep. The silence that followed was deafening. I was left alone with questions I could not answer, standing amidst the cold steel drawers and the sterile scent of the morgue, haunted by the impossible. That night, I learned that death is not always what it seems. And, in that realization, the story of Jane Thompson, a story that would challenge everything I thought I knew about life, death and the fragile line between, began. Before that fateful night, Jane Thompson was a woman defined by resilience as much as by her fragility. She lived in a modest apartment, the walls lined with books and photographs, snapshots of vacations she barely had the energy to enjoy, smiles frozen in happier times. Jane had spent most of her adult life in and out of hospitals, battling a heart that struggled to keep pace with her body's demands, and an autoimmune disorder that flared unpredictably, leaving her weak and vulnerable. Her condition was complicated, a puzzle even seasoned doctors approached with caution. Yet, through it all, she carried herself with quiet dignity, a determination that life, no matter how precarious, was still worth facing. The audience sees her navigating everyday tasks, carefully lifting groceries from the counter, pausing to catch her breath, her body betraying her with subtle tremors, her hands unsteady from medication and fatigue. Doctors explain, in plain terms, that her heart was like a worn-out pump, straining to circulate blood efficiently. Even small exertion risked dangerous arrhythmias, and flare-ups of her autoimmune disorder could strike without warning, leaving her incapacitated for days. Friends describe evenings spent in whispered conversations, helping her dress, preparing meals, and sitting vigil as her body fought battles invisible to the casual observer. Family members share their memories, painting a portrait of a woman who was vibrant, stubborn, and deeply human. They speak of laughter that filled her apartment, of a warmth that contradicted the chronic pain she endured. Jane's doctors recount the delicate balancing act required to maintain her stability. Doses adjusted minutely, heart rhythms monitored closely, flare-ups managed with precision. Every hospitalization was a reminder of mortality, and yet Jane met each day with courage. Her struggle was not simply against illness, but against the uncertainty and fragility that defined her existence. Cinematic reenactments show Jane lying in a hospital bed, Monitors beeping, a nurse checking her vitals, her hand trembling slightly as she reaches for a cup of water. The camera lingers on the subtle details, the tension in her chest as she inhales, the faint pallor of her skin, the tired but defiant gleam in her eyes. These visual cues translate medical complexity into something tangible for the audience. Life teetering on a razor's edge, a body operating under conditions no human is meant to endure indefinitely. The narrative emphasizes empathy. Jane is not merely a patient. She's a person whose life, relationships, and quiet joys existed alongside her medical struggles. The tension between her vitality and vulnerability foreshadows the impossible event that would later unfold. The audience is asked to understand her humanity, to feel the weight of every heartbeat she fought to maintain, and to recognize the fragility of the line between life and death. In this way, her story is both universal and deeply personal, a meditation on endurance, hope, and the unpredictable nature of the human body. By the end of this section, Jane is no longer an abstract case study. She is alive in memory, in struggle, in the hearts of those who loved her. And the audience is left with an urgent question. How could someone so physically fragile, so carefully monitored, later be declared dead, only to move again in the quiet of the morgue? The tension builds, emotionally intimate, as the story begins to circle back toward the night that would defy all expectations. The night Jane Thompson arrived at the morgue was quiet, almost oppressively so, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every sound sharper, more immediate. I had worked midnight shifts before, walking these corridors while the rest of the hospital slept, the hum of distant machines the only soundtrack. The morgue smelled of cold steel and antiseptic, a sterile smell that clung to everything, yet on this night it felt suffocating. The drawers were lined in perfect order, each labeled meticulously, a stark reminder of the routine, methodical nature of death that I had come to trust. I remember approaching her drawer slowly, hands hovering above the cold metal. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls, exaggerating the familiar into the uncanny. Each step seemed louder than the last. And then, a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible motion inside the drawer. At first I paused, questioning what I thought I had seen. Morgues have their own language of sounds, metal scraping, vents hissing, pipes groaning. I tried to convince myself it was one of those ordinary noises. But the movement came again, a subtle twitch that I could not ignore. As I leaned closer, the drawer seemed almost alive. Jane's fingers twitched, curling slightly as if reaching for something, or someone, beyond the edge of the sterile steel. My breath caught. Time slowed. The clinical detachment I had cultivated over years evaporated instantly. She was not a corpse in that moment. She was human. And yet, every instinct screamed that this was impossible. I froze, unsure whether to call for help, unsure whether I was witnessing life or hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. Her movements were slight at first, almost imperceptible, but they carried weight, a defiance that made the room feel charged, electric. Slowly, she attempted to lift her head, a half motion that seemed deliberate and horrifyingly alive. My hands shook, pressing against the cold drawer, and I could feel my heart racing in the rhythm of terror and awe. Each fraction of movement she made, an eyelid flicker, a finger curling, was amplified by the silence, by the emptiness surrounding us. The morgue had become a stage for the inexplicable, a theater where the rules of life and death were suspended, if only for a brief, haunting moment. I remember the moral paralysis. What could I do? Every protocol I had memorized offered no guidance here. To call for help felt both urgent and futile, like breaking a spell that I wasn't sure had been cast. I was caught between fear for my own safety, respect for Jane, and a desperate need to understand what was happening. Was this some rare physiological event, a misdiagnosis, or a glimpse beyond the limits of science? My mind raced for answers, but none came, and then, almost imperceptibly, the movement ceased. Jane lay still once more, as if she had never moved at all. The silence returned, deeper this time, almost oppressive. I stood there, frozen, staring at the cold metal, haunted by the impossibility of what I had witnessed. Every step back, every breath, was a negotiation with disbelief. That night, the morgue was no longer merely a repository of the dead. It became a place of questions, of mystery, of a fragile line between life and death that I had never before dared to imagine. As I left that night, the echoes of her brief motion lingered. Every shadow, every faint sound in the empty corridors reminded me of her presence and the impossible truth. Jane Thompson had moved when she should not have. And in that movement, a story had begun, a story that would challenge science, ethics, and the very understanding of what it means to be alive. The moment Jane Thompson moved in the morgue left me haunted. But for the medical professionals who examined her case afterward, it became a puzzle, both fascinating and unnerving. I reached out to cardiologists, pathologists, and ICU nurses, and what they offered was a mixture of awe, caution, and humility. Dr. Helen Ramirez, a cardiologist with decades of experience, explained gently that the human body can sometimes behave in ways textbooks barely account for. There are conditions, she said, that slow the heart to imperceptible beats, that make a person appear dead when, in fact, life lingers in the background. Rare arrhythmias, suspended animation, these are not miracles. They're the body's last stubborn act of survival. As she spoke, images of Jane's fragile chest appeared in my mind. The tiny, irregular pulses that could easily be mistaken for nothing at all. The fragile rhythm of life hiding beneath layers of illness. Animated graphics in the hospital's presentation rooms illustrated the mechanics. A heart that almost stops. The blood barely moving, brain activity continuing silently in the background. The body teetering on the knife edge between death and life. The concept, explained simply, was almost poetic. The body refuses finality, clinging to life in imperceptible gestures. Hidden in places science often cannot detect without extreme precision. Pathologists emphasized how rare it was to misdiagnose death in modern hospitals, but they admitted it could happen, particularly with patients like Jane, whose underlying conditions complicated assessments. Catalepsy, a phenomenon in which the body becomes rigid and unresponsive yet remains alive internally, was one possibility. Another was a profound physiological shutdown where organs slowed dramatically, masking any outward signs of life. The explanations were clinical, precise, and yet no one could fully dismiss the uncanny timing, the almost cinematic drama of a patient moving in a morgue. ICU nurses recounted similar experiences. Rare cases where patients declared dead seemed to resist the finality. One nurse described a patient whose fingers twitched moments after death, leaving the team questioning their own training, ethics, and understanding. These stories were never celebrated or sensationalized. They were treated with respect, as reminders of the fragility and unpredictability of life. It was in these reflections that the boundary between science and mystery began to blur, as professionals balanced technical knowledge with the humility required to face the unknown. Emotionally, the audience begins to feel both awe and unease. The experts' words convey wonder, but also caution, emphasizing that the human body can defy expectation in ways even the most experienced clinicians find unsettling. There's no clear answer, no neat resolution, only theories, probabilities, and the profound acknowledgement that mortality is not always absolute. For every explanation offered, the haunting moment in the morgue remains, a question without a definitive answer. In that uncertainty lies the true fascination of Jane Thompson's case. Medicine, with all its rigor and precision, is vast, yet its boundaries are tested by events like this. The audience is invited to wonder, to feel the tension between knowledge and the inexplicable, to recognize the delicate line between life and death that can be crossed in an instant, leaving behind a question that science may never fully resolve. Jane's brief movement becomes more than a mystery. It is a testament to the resilience of the human body and the limits of our understanding. After the events in the morgue, the weight of what I had witnessed did not fade. Nights became restless, shadows lengthened in ways that seemed to echo Jane's brief motion, and every quiet sound felt amplified. But it wasn't only me. Family members carried an invisible burden, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering dread. They had been told Jane was gone, yet her story, brief as her movement was, challenged their understanding of reality and mortality. Psychologists explain that witnessing such anomalies can leave lasting emotional scars, creating a tension between rational thought and the instinctive, almost primal. Fear that life has slipped through your fingers only to return in fragments. Interviews with Jane's sister, Linda, revealed sleepless nights spent replaying the memory. "I kept thinking," she said softly, "what if she really was still in there trying to tell us something?" Her voice carried grief and wonder simultaneously, a reminder that family members are often caught between hope and despair, unable to fully reconcile medical explanations with lived experience. For those of us who were present, the emotional toll was compounded by professional responsibility. How does one act ethically when witnessing an event that defies established medical knowledge? Ethicists I spoke to framed this dilemma in clinical but empathetic terms. Medicine relies on protocols, on the certainty of diagnosis and procedure, yet there are moments when the human element, the weight of observation, the responsibility to act, collides with uncertainty. The assistant who witnessed Jane's motion could have reacted in ways that risked harm or breached ethical boundaries, yet inaction carried its own burden. These reflections highlight a deep truth. Being present for life, even at its limits, is as much a moral challenge as it is a scientific one. The psychological dimension is equally haunting. Experts explain that humans crave closure, the ability to categorize events as either normal or miraculous, alive or dead. An anomaly like Jane's defies these categories, leaving the mind suspended in a liminal space between comprehension and mystery. For those of us who experience it firsthand, the effect is both humbling and disorienting. Cinematic reenactments show hands gripping railings, family members holding worn photographs, shadows stretching across hospital rooms, all visual metaphors for the emotional weight that lingers long after the physical event has passed. The narrative slows in these moments, emphasizing reflection and empathy over spectacle. The audience is invited to sit with discomfort, to consider the human cost of uncertainty, and to understand that the unseen emotional ripple of medical anomalies can be as profound as the physiological ones. Jane's brief movement is no longer simply a medical mystery. It is a lens through which the audience experiences grief, wonder, fear, and moral contemplation. Ultimately, this section underscores that the human element cannot be separated from the science of medicine. Each heartbeat, each twitch, carries emotional resonance that transcends explanation. The tension between knowing and not knowing, between professional detachment and personal empathy, becomes central to the story. As the audience moves forward, the lingering question is clear. How do we reconcile the limits of our understanding with the profound, often unexplainable persistence of life? Even after consulting experts, reviewing Jane Thompson's medical records, and witnessing her brief movement firsthand, the questions remained. The morgue, once a place of predictable routine, had become a chamber of uncertainty. I often found myself walking those silent corridors alone, replaying the moment, trying to reconcile what I saw with everything I had been trained to know. How could a body, monitored, declared dead, and placed in a cold steel drawer, suddenly display movement? Every test, every theory, fell short of a definitive answer. And yet, there it was. Jane, defying finality in the most human of ways. The limitations of science became starkly clear. Cardiac arrhythmias, catalepsy, suspended animation. Each explanation carried plausibility, but none fully captured the eerie timing, the almost deliberate nature of her movements. Pathologists stressed how rare such phenomena were, admitting that modern medicine, for all its sophistication, can only measure certain parameters of life. Consciousness, subtle neurological activity, the precise thresholds of death, all remain elusive in ways that no monitor, no protocol can completely capture. Jane's case became a living reminder of the unknown variables that lie hidden in every body. In every hospital corridor, in every moment, we assume death is absolute. Cinematically, the scene returns to the morgue's cold, dimly lit halls. The camera pans slowly across empty drawers, the metallic surfaces reflecting a ghostly light. Moonlight filters through high windows, cutting across the sterile floors, and shadows stretch long into the silence. The audience feels the same haunting weight, the tension between knowledge and the unknowable. Each echo of a distant monitor, each creak in the floorboards, reminds us of the fragile threshold between life and death, an invisible line that Jane's brief movement exposed, however fleetingly. The philosophical implications are profound. What does it mean to truly die? Is death a single, instantaneous event, or a gradual process that may, in rare instances, allow consciousness or motor activity to linger beyond observable signs? Ethicists and neurologists alike confront this boundary, acknowledging the emotional, moral, and professional challenges posed by such anomalies. For families, these moments can create a lifetime of questions. For professionals, they are a humbling testament to the limits of expertise, a reminder that even certainty in medicine is, at times, provisional. As the narration slows, the audience is left with the lingering, almost unbearable tension of mystery. Jane Thompson's brief movement becomes a symbol, a haunting question mark against the sterile confidence of science. It reminds us that life, in all its complexity, may not always fit neatly within the confines of what we understand. The boundary between living and dead is thinner than we believe, sometimes flexible, sometimes defiant. And in that space, the story of Jane Thompson lingers, unsolved, unsettling, and unforgettable. Jane Thompson's story did not end with the impossibility of that night. It continued in the memories of those who loved her, in the reflections of those who witnessed her fleeting defiance of death, and in the quiet lessons learned by medical professionals who encountered the unexplained. Her family speaks of her not as a medical anomaly, but as a woman full of life, laughter, and small gestures that made their world brighter. Her sister recalls afternoons spent baking together, the smell of cinnamon lingering in the air, the sound of Jane's laughter spilling into empty corners of their apartment. These ordinary human moments stand in stark contrast to the extraordinary circumstances that later unfolded in the morgue, reminding us that life is measured as much in the mundane as in the miraculous. For me, the morgue assistant, the impact was profound. Each shift afterwards carried the weight of uncertainty, the awareness that even in a place dedicated to death, life could assert itself in the most unexpected ways. I began to see my work differently, not as a series of routine tasks, but as a profound responsibility to honor both life and the mysteries it contains. The story of Jane Thompson became a lens through which I viewed every patient, every drawer, every silent moment with renewed empathy and humility. Medical professionals reflected on the case as well. Doctors and nurses described how witnessing or learning of Jane's brief movement had shifted their understanding of death, care, and human resilience. Some adjusted protocols, more vigilant in monitoring subtle signs that might otherwise be overlooked. Others spoke of the emotional lesson, the importance of compassion alongside procedure, the recognition that even in precise clinical environments, the human element cannot be ignored. Her case reminded them that medicine, while rooted in science, is ultimately a practice of understanding, connection, and respect for the life it serves. Cinematically, the narrative slows. shifting from sterile hospital corridors to warm personal spaces. Sunlight streams through living room windows, illuminating family photographs, hands clasped in remembrance, and the quiet presence of objects imbued with memory. Archival footage of Jane, smiling at a picnic, holding a child's hand, reading a book, plays softly, juxtaposed against the cold, dim morgue where the story of her brief, inexplicable movement began. These images honor her humanity, emphasizing the profound connection between the miraculous and the everyday. As the documentary closes, the narration takes a reflective, almost meditative tone. Jane Thompson's story does not provide answers. It offers questions about life, death, consciousness, and the resilience of the human body. It asks the audience to recognize the limits of understanding, to honor the mystery that resides in every heartbeat, every twitch, every flicker of motion that science may not fully explain. Her legacy is not just a medical case. It is a testament to empathy, human connection, and the awe-inspiring complexity of life itself. In the end, we are left haunted, not by fear, but by wonder, by the knowledge that even in places defined by endings, life can assert itself in ways that defy explanation. Jane Thompson's brief motion in the morgue remains a reminder. Medicine can illuminate much, but life, and the mysteries woven into it, cannot always be contained, explained, or fully understood. And perhaps in that lingering uncertainty, there's a lesson more profound than any clinical finding could ever provide.